Hello, welcome to another episode of Global Paul's Rethink the Future, a podcast dealing with our market-orientated way of life and whether or not there is any way that we could potentialise life beyond the way how it's currently given. So in today's episode, I want to talk about God. So the question is that can we redeem God? And what would it mean to do so? Is it worth doing? Can we kind of frame this question outside the traditions, I suppose, that's given us God as a principle? And what would we have to do to potentialise our way of thinking about God without necessarily being beholden to the story? So why would we, let's think of why should we or can we redeem God, and why would we want to? What's worth preserving in God? Now, let's think of creation or creativity. So if we are market orientated and we accept our roles as consumers, then we've accepted a limitation of agency or creativity on our part in order for us to substantiate our roles as such. So when you're looking at the redemption of God, you're really looking at the redeeming creativity within our lives. So are we problematizing creativity by connecting it with God? Or is it through the question of God, do we look at creativity or creation as something beyond our own acts? Okay, so this is the reason why I'm framing it like this. So as much as that we can animate, say, through our actions, certain changes, or either substantiate the way how the world is given, or that if we work contra to that givenness of that way of life, create the possibility for life that's otherwise not given. When we do so, well, then that's just indicating that the openness towards creativity. But we don't necessarily have to substantiate maybe God, or this is the thing. So this comes down to the story of God and the way how we have accepted it, and whether or not there's anything that can be redeemed from the story that we've really been orientated towards thus far. So let's look at that. So I always frame this from the aspect of the biblical notions of creation. So because I feel it's important, especially within Western countries, and obviously the Bible as a book is obviously very influential. And so therefore when you're looking at the aspect of divinity, then we can just look at the 7 days of creation to understand how a lot of people, if you consider not only Jews and Christians but Muslims as well, their understanding of divinity obviously relates to specifically to the 7 days of creation. Whether or not you're an atheist or not, it doesn't really, or a humanist, it doesn't really matter. We're looking at like a current kind of paradigm, and the reason why it's, if we look at it from the aspect of 7 days creation, is because our lives kind of substantiate that model for ourselves as well. So when you're looking at God, it's really looking at the way how we model our own lives, and so they substantiate the order when it's beholden to a model for life as far as the 7 days of creation, as it were. So when we're looking at God, and we're looking at creation. So one of the things that if we look at if you're looking at it from the aspect to say that God created the world, but let's just say it's the world, so it's a cosmological order that relates specifically to a point in time, as it were. So as much as you might conflate divinity as far as its overarching vision towards everything within the cosmos at large, it obviously relates to the specific sphere of that God's influence as far as its ability to be a galvanizing force. So when you're looking at at creation, we have to give context to the word creation. Creation does not necessarily mean to say that it's the whole universe. All right, so creation here is important because if our understanding of divinity is creation, but that creation is in context of the world, of creating a world, well, it's one world amongst others. So therefore we can say that the scope of divinity is circumscribed as far as its creative portent that runs through the lives of all the people that share in that power or the potential that God endows. Okay, so we can just remove the whole conflation of creativity to creating the heavens and earth, and just relate it back to the specific world that is engendered as a result of that. Now, why is that important? So, well, you could look at it from the aspect of that if there's a current order that's reigning and that order is contingent upon framing the story of God, then can we look at a way of engendering, of redeeming God in light of the creation of another world? Now, all traditions, a lot of the traditions of the religious traditions, spiritual traditions, have this kind of in mind when they talk of eschatology or the messianic, as it were. So there's lots of figures within history that that kind of frames this, because if you have a current, say, existing order or paradigm, and yet maybe these cultures or these traditions are beholden to an arc or an origin, and so therefore this specific story, but they can't see beyond maybe the impasse of that creation, then what we're really looking at is a way how you can animate that creativity or that power that's maybe latent within all the spiritual traditions of the planet in a way that you can reconcile them through a different story of God. Okay, so whereby the differences are such that they can reconcile to a point where you're taking certain principles. So I suppose you're abstracting the principle from the story, and so therefore to give the story that could be engendered greater portent for all the peoples of the planet. So when you're looking at the redeeming God, the redeeming of God is the redeeming God of outside its creation, the world that God has supposedly created, and then looking at a way how that we do justice to all the peoples on the planet, whereby whether or not it's a mythical ancestor, a culture hero, whether or not there's the presupposition of a God that's transcendent from earth, that is meant to be the most high. So it's got to do with truth and falsity kind of claims. We can just completely disregard that and just look at it from the aspect of making sense of the traditions that has been engendered on this planet, but in a way where we can get we can harness the scope of that power that works through us in order to create a new creation. Okay, so a lot of the way how eschatology gets framed is really dealing with an impasse or maybe a transition from one way of life to a certain paradigm to another. Now, what we have to give due regard to is that, well, we don't have to redeem, if you're looking at it from a Judeo-Christian kind of perspective, redeem creation or creaturely life, so therefore be beholden to the understanding of original sin or anything else like that. You are redeeming the creation. All right, so the creation here is not creaturely life as such, but it literally is the order that reigns. You're redeeming basically the creation that has come about as a result of being beholden to a specific story of God. Now that context here is that let's use the way how we can frame so the seventh day is of creation. And then look at the seventh day is the one where there's a latent potential that exists to animate creativity. So the reason why it's important from this aspect is to consider it in light of our own lives. So there's no point talking about God if you're talking about theology or whether or not you're a kind of you're religious and all you're doing is just talking back and forth to no end that doesn't relate to actually the practicalities of life, it's totally redundant as far as that goes. So we are literally looking at the imminent kind of structure of our lives that substantiates basically the story that has been given about God thus far. So when you are talking about redeeming God, you are talking about redeeming something within yourself that you've accepted. All right, that you've accepted a diminution of what it means to be in light of that story of God that is marginalised and impoverished basically people as a result of it. Okay, so that is one way that we can look at it. So how can we frame that understanding? Okay, so if we think of, if we labour, all right, for 6 days and say that we have the Sabbath, or the divine Sabbath, or the afterlife, like I said, always say the afterlife and the Sabbath and your retirement and your weekend are all exactly the same. It doesn't matter. It's all immanentized. So it's a Hermetic kind of principle if you want to look at another tradition where so below, as above, so below, so outside, so inside. So there's literally no distinction that you can make. We like to think that we're secular, all right, but this is the issue. If we're secular, yet what reigns in our secularism is basically the power of violence of the divinity, as it were. So whether or not you're going to look at this from the aspect of the exceptionalism that reigns within our sovereignty, and so the way how power can make an exception that will determine the rule, and so therefore marginalise you for the sake of that power that reigns, then we really don't gain anything by saying that we're secular or not, when we're still beholden to a power that's transcendent to the power that we don't animate within our lives. All right, and so I always frame it from, Christ, the sayings attributed to Christ, that my kingdom is not of this world, and yet you must render unto Caesar. So if we're looking at the way how you can reconcile or redeem God, you're really looking at the way you can reconcile those statements of Christ through the supplement and that we make of our time when we're beholden to a model for life that's predicated off the 7 days of creation. So in this context, why do I say that? Well, let's just let's step back, okay? So if creation, if God has created the world, then God, it means to say it has to be managed. It's managed on our behalf for our betterment, supposedly. Okay, so that's basically the model that's kind of reigned. The world has been created, and so therefore that presupposes the mediation of the creation through people that are meant to be have skill to understand the word of God. So we can understand the nature of priests, the scribes. You can see the nature of the way how prophets are utilised as far as this kind of story goes, right down to its apotheosis into the word made flesh, as it were. The issue here is that you have, in the practicalities of life, you substantiate a way of life that emulates the model for creation. So you can actually remove everything and only just look at the one story of Genesis and disregard everything. Right? You don't even have to look at anything else other than that. Why? Well, because you literally are looking at the way of the ancients would have approached God in that context. So, I always say that if there was material deprivation was such that in that brutish existence of our forebears, where they had to toil in order to secure their lives, and so therefore on the seventh day, on the Sabbath, they could relax like God did, then you can understand that way of framing the story of God is contingent upon a certain way of life. Now, for the most part, material deprivation has been removed, and so what persists is the spiritual poverty or the spiritual deprivation when you're beholden to that understanding of divinity, of that specific kind of God. Okay, so how can I say that? So let's say, what does that mean when you say that? So that means to say that if you are beholden to an understanding of 6 days of creation and 7 days of rest, that indicates a level of spiritual poverty, because what you're doing is you're accepting the world as a given. It's managed on your behalf, and you're not animating the seventh day of creation. You're not animating the potential of the Sabbath. Why? And so therefore you linearize your understanding of your existence, because you're always securing, you're always a means towards the end of being the Sabbath, the afterlife, your weekend, or your retirement. So what you're doing is that in your labouring, you are not giving the way how a divinity would give if it creates constantly, perpetually, without exception. No exception of the Sabbath. We're talking about 7 days of creation. All right. There's no seventh day of rest. Why is there no 7 days of rest? Because literally what you're looking at is the order that reigns is not one that's predicated of material deprivation, but spiritual deprivation. But if there's spiritual deprivation, then what you're creating is you're not creating the means and continuum that is modelled off essentially God. As far as those seventh days, you're looking at the way how you can engender an artful way of life, whereby you create art, all right, where you take the potential of creativity that's latent within the existent paradigm, but potentialize it by redeeming your understanding of what God is. Okay, so in that case, what does that mean for the practicalities of life? Well, okay, so just think of what we are. We always say that we're a means towards the end. Our time is an economic good. For our time to be an economic good, it's immaterial whether or not you're looking at the Sabbath, so you're looking at your leisure, or you're looking at your labour. Right? If it's an economic good, it's an economic good irrespective of the marginality of you determine whether or not you're a means or an end. Now, if it's an economic good, it means to say it's been abstracted from life. It's been abstracted from, let's say, eternity, or the constraint of the way how it gets inframed. And so therefore you're ordered against time through that sequential ordering of time. All right. So in that regards, why? Well, what are you securing? You're securing your time against other people. You're securing it as a stock, as a supplement. So it's supplementary to the mean of your existence, to your existence. So let's step back from that and think of what, if we're looking at the way how we can frame God. If we're talking about creation, we're talking about a different form of life, so an artful way of life. All right, a way that we can emulate the cosmos, the way how the cosmos gives. Then what you're doing is that you're really trying to emulate a way of engendering a culture that emulates what we find that with life that gives. Okay, so think of the earth kind of gives. It's our mother and it gives, all right, and we receive it. The sun gives, all right, everything kind of gives. So are we emulating that as far as our understanding of our way towards life? Well, the answer is you'll say no, because you're giving so you may receive the supplement of time. You're giving so the understanding of that kind of transactional nature of a means and continuum that will substantiate the Sabbath is very much a kind of contractual kind of arrangement that you've made with the divinity. You know, you do X so you may receive, and then you must be grateful for it. But then what are you doing? How can you potentialize your receptivity of what you receive, and do justice to the potential of that supplement, whereby you redeem God in light of the potential that exists within God, we could say. So in that context, are you actually taking the tradition that you're beholden to and potentializing it beyond the reception? So if we work back to where we are, but then think of what that means. Well, what's outside of any religious kind of understanding, just think of being market orientated. That's a predominant mode of life that we're beholden to. So the receptivity here is receiving ourselves as consumers. So what is the context here from a God is that the creation is given, right? It's managed. Now, if you're a consumer, the way of life is just given. You're as only as good as your wants. You don't create the world. You don't animate the world. All right. So if you're not given any credit for the way, because you give credit to a divinity, And so therefore, and you're giving credit to the people who manage the power of that divinity. So whether or not you're looking at it from the aspect of kind of the acolytes or the priestly caste, or whether or not you're looking at it from the technocrats or from all the machinations of the absolute state, so all the ministers of state and all I mean, it doesn't matter. All of that, it's all encompassed in the way how the world is given, and it's managed on your behalf, and you're given no credit towards the way how life could be engendered beyond that. So as a consumer, the model here is that, is there a connection between being a consumer and being passive as far as accepting the way how the world has been created and the way how it's managed on your behalf? Now, if you don't, the thing here is that, well, okay, then what's open? What's open for me to potentialise life beyond the way how it's currently given now? So that's literally is the way that you make yourself a supplement to life, through the way how you preserve yourself in the face of a possibility or a potential that you don't want to animate, where you're risking life beyond the way how it's currently given, which is the current paradigm and your understanding of divinity or God. So if God is the highest creative portent, let's say, that we can animate, as it were, then you work back to, okay, if I'm a consumer and I'm a no one, right, but yet if I work contra to the givenness of our way of life as a no one, and I'm potentialising the fullest scope of my creativity, I always say nobody can be responsible for what is created when everybody's doing the same thing. So if no one's created, all right, no one is credited. All right, do you give credit to, who do you give credit to? Now, you don't give credit in the sense that you're going to go worship God. All right, this is the whole, you're transcending the whole paradigm of worship, as it were, because what you're doing is you're engendering a good within that community or that civilization or that culture, where basically it's more visceral, as it were. It's not orientated towards what? Towards the Holy of Holies or towards a specific temple. Why? Because literally it's everywhere. It's everywhere. It's in between people. It's in between people because you're immersed in this thing. You're embodying an ethos or a way of life. So when you're looking at the way how we think that, all right, if the no one cannot be given credit for it, and so therefore, because we all are animating, through the marginal way how we receive ourselves, the indivisibility of our temporality, but we have to work in the paradigm that we accept for ourselves now, and so therefore we have this tradition, this transition kind of period that we're straddling. So therefore, we have to work within the marginality in order to potentialise the indivisibility. But through doing that, we are engendering through our own acts, animating that goodwill that otherwise money conceals. Well, you're not going off and saying, "Yea, praise to God. You are wonderful. How you've given me everything, and I should praise thanks." You'll be grateful, but that gratitude is extended. It doesn't have a locus, right? It's not orientated towards place. It's literally, so if you're talking about the way how, say, churches and temples always became a loci for the sacred, it's literally a way how that where is the sacred, where is divinity lie, if we're looking at it cosmologically from the aspect of this, the absolute beauty that life is when you are allowing a culture that enables us to experience that. It means to say the whole planet becomes a temple. The whole planet becomes like a church, or whatever the case you want to do. It becomes like sacred, as it were. It becomes the embodiment of the Holy of Holies. It is. And does that mean to say that you're redeeming Earth? No, the Earth is beautiful the way I heard it. You're redeeming the culture that the Earth is beholden to. All right, you're redeeming the creation that we've created as a result of being beholden to an understanding of divinity or creativity, or the way how we've modelled ourselves when we accept the world as a given and it's managed on our behalf. So once again, when you're looking at credit, it's not that you're never giving credit for one. It's not to one person. It's not to a specific entity that's beyond you. It's immanent. It's like immanent within life. Like, so if you're looking at the way how if the transcendental, which is the vestige of the transcendental, exists in our spiritual aspiration towards independence, and you're literally looking at being market orientated and the differential of values. The differential of values is there's an aperture between people because you have what underwrites. If we're market orientated and want is primary because money is a given, what underwrites that is those timelines that has that spiritual aspiration of independence and the unavowed utopianism that we're beholden to. So when you're looking at the way you can collapse value and you're looking at the excluded middle of an exchange, that's the way how you're potentializing the spirit, if I can put it, the spirit of creation, the spirit of creativity to redeem creation, to redeem God, to redeem the force of that good, as it were. Okay, so, and it's not beholden to any specific tradition as much as that what I'm doing is I'm framing the current paradigm of the 7 days of creation because that's what people are beholden to. We're beholden to a structuring of our time and where the economic good reigns, which has a vestiges of that transcendentalism within our spiritual aspirations, especially when time is an economic good and we presuppose money. And money is nothing else than having credit towards life. So if you're going to give credit here, where are you going to give credit? Where are you going to give credit? So the whole thing is that you can't give credit to one particular person for the way of life that you helped create and engender and pass down to future generations. Because that what happens there in this reconciliation of differences of traditions, you literally are engendering a true global culture that is a way of doing justice, for want of a better way of describing it, to all the differences of approaching life, but then not being beholden to it. And so through time given, a lot of the stories that we tell ourselves just fall by the wayside. And the reason why they fall by the wayside is because the story that you're helping create, it's a way of, okay, are you redeeming God in light of what we do? But by redeeming God, we're not really giving thanks to God in the sense that of the spatiality or the orientation, because the orientation here, there's no orientation. It's literally you're immersed in such a way that there's no orientation towards the way how you can give thanks, because literally you're embodying gratitude. All right, you're embodying it constantly. And why is that? Because there's something about the way how that you can give towards life that you emulate giving, the spirit that gives. And what you're doing is that you just remove the claim that otherwise works on you, the vestiges of a culture that is ossified. Okay, and you've potentialized it beyond the reception of that in a way where over time, with the time given, you're allowing a more artful way of life that redeems, it's beautiful, that beautifies, that does justice to ourselves in the sense of we're no longer marginal in reference towards life, but we're indivisible, and we can then incarnate the end that we are, as it were. And then in that regards, maybe there's something that's given that's just never been given before. But I always say this seems all aspirational, and maybe it is. But then you step back from that. Well, where are we now? We're marginal. So therefore we have to work in the margins that we've accepted for ourselves in order to potentialise the indivisibility of our temporality. So we have to potentialise our time beyond the economic good to temporalise place for a common surpassing. So temporalised place is important, because if you understand what I'm saying, then it means to say that you can temporalise place everywhere over the planet for a common surpassing. That common surpassing is shared because you're potentializing your time beyond the economic good that you're currently receiving it as. And so the commonality that you share with other people doing the same things, irrespective of whether or not you don't necessarily share the same tradition, or even if you're an atheist as such, it really doesn't matter in that regards. But what you're doing is that you're sharing the same kind of praxis, the same kind of doing things, where what you're doing is that you are removing the vestiges of something that would otherwise claim you, and you're opening out yourself towards life. Anyway, hopefully that kind of explains maybe the one way of looking at God, where we can start to kind of give it due consideration rather than just being beholden to the story thus far. Anyway, until next time, take care.